The snow came down in thick, relentless sheets, swallowing the city in a quiet that felt almost unnatural. Streetlights flickered through the storm like distant, fading stars, their pale glow barely reaching the frozen pavement below. The wind carried the snow sideways, sharp and stinging, turning every exposed inch of skin numb within seconds. Most people had already disappeared behind locked doors and glowing windows, retreating into warmth, into safety, into lives where storms were just something to watch from the other side of glass. Everyone except him. The boy stood at the corner of the empty street, shifting his weight from one foot to the other in a futile attempt to keep feeling in his toes. His shoes were worn through at the edges, letting in the cold with every step he took. His jeans were thin, stiff with dampness, and his hands, red, cracked, trembling, were buried deep inside the sleeves of a jacket that was far too big for him. It had once been dark blue, maybe even warm once. Now it was faded, torn along the seams, the zipper stuck halfway up so it never fully closed. The collar scratched his neck, and the lining had long since thinned to almost nothing. But it was still his most valuable possession. It was the only thing standing between him and the kind of cold that could make a person disappear. His name was Eli, though no one had said it out loud in weeks. Names didn't matter much out here. People didn't ask, and he didn't offer. He had learned quickly that the less people noticed you, the easier it was to survive. Still, he watched them. Cars rushed past in bursts, their headlights slicing through the storm, their tires crunching loudly over the snow. Inside, he could see silhouettes, people talking, laughing, sipping something hot. Their lives moved fast, insulated from the world he stood in. None of them slowed down. None of them looked. They never did. Eli pulled his jacket tighter around himself, pressing his chin down into the frayed collar. His breath came out in small, uneven clouds. He tried not to think about how long the night still was. That was when he heard it. A low, rumbling growl cut through the wind, deep and mechanical. It didn't belong to the quiet of the storm. It grew louder, closer, until a black motorcycle burst into view, its headlight blazing through the snow like a spotlight. It stopped sharply near the curb across the street. Then another engine followed. And another. Within seconds, a line of heavy motorcycles stood idling in the storm, their presence loud, solid, impossible to ignore. The men who rode them were just as imposing, broad-shouldered, dressed in thick leather, their vests marked with patches that caught the light every time they moved. Eli stiffened. He knew better than to get close to people like that. Even without understanding the details, he understood the feeling they carried with them, danger, authority, a kind of world he had no place in. He instinctively stepped back, retreating into the deep shadow of a closed storefront, pressing himself against the cold glass as if he could disappear into it. From there, he watched. One of the bikers swung off his motorcycle, boots hitting the ground with a heavy thud. Others followed, their movements calm, controlled, like they had done this 100 times before. They spoke briefly among themselves, voices low and lost in the wind. Then she appeared. She stepped off the back of one of the bikes, slower than the others, her balance slightly unsteady on the slick pavement. Her long dark hair was dusted with snow, strands clinging to her face as the wind pushed against her. She wasn't dressed for this kind of weather, not really. Her coat was thin, fitted, more for style than survival, and the boots she wore looked expensive but impractical for the deepening snow. She wrapped her arms around herself, shoulders pulling inward as the cold cut through her. Eli noticed immediately. He didn't mean to, but he did. There was something about the way she tried to hide it, tried to stand straight, tried to look unaffected, that made it obvious she was freezing. Her movements were tight, controlled, like she was fighting her own body. She spoke to one of the men, her voice too soft to carry across the street. The biker nodded, then gestured toward a nearby building. One by one, the men started heading that way, leaving her behind for a moment on the sidewalk. Alone. The wind surged, whipping snow around her legs. She pulled her coat tighter, but it didn't help. Not really. Eli felt something twist in his chest. He knew that feeling too well. The kind of cold that didn't just sit on your skin but worked its way inward, settling into your bones until you couldn't stop shaking. Until your thoughts slowed down. Until everything felt distant and heavy. He looked down at his jacket. It hung off him awkwardly, sleeves too long, fabric worn thin, but it was still warmth. Still protection. Still the difference between making it through the night and not. For a moment, he gripped it tighter, his fingers curling into the fabric. Don't. The thought came sharp and instinctive. You need it. He shifted his weight, glancing back toward the alley behind him, toward the place he usually curled up when the nights got bad. If he stayed where he was, if he kept what little he had, he might get through this. Probably. He looked back at her. She had stopped moving now, standing almost completely still. Her head dipped slightly, her shoulders shaking despite her effort to stay composed. Something about that, about the quiet way she endured it, made his decision for him. Before he could change his mind, Eli pushed himself off the wall and stepped out into the storm. Each step across the street felt heavier than the last. The snow crunched under his worn shoes, the cold biting harder now that he was moving directly into the wind. His heart pounded, not just from the cold, but from the strange, unfamiliar feeling of doing something that mattered. When he reached her, he hesitated for just a second. She turned at the sound, startled, her eyes widening as she noticed him standing there. Up close, she looked even colder than he had thought, her lips slightly pale, her breath uneven. "Hey, are you okay?" she asked, her voice gentle despite the surprise. Eli didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached up with stiff fingers and pulled off his jacket. The cold hit him instantly, sharp and unforgiving, but he ignored it as best he could. He held the jacket out toward her, his arms shaking slightly from the effort. She stared at it, confused. "You're cold," he said quietly, his voice almost lost in the wind. "You can take it." For a moment, she just looked at him, trying to understand. Then realization hit. No, I can't take that," she said quickly, shaking her head. "You need it more than I do." Eli shrugged, a small, almost careless motion. "I'm used to it." The words hung in the air between them, heavier than anything else. She looked at him then, not just at his face, but at everything. The thin sweater underneath, the shaking hands, the quiet acceptance in his eyes. Something shifted in her expression, something deeper than surprise. Slowly, almost carefully, she reached out and took the jacket from him. It dwarfed her just as it had him. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice softer now, almost fragile. Eli nodded once, not trusting himself to say anything else. Then he turned and walked away, back across the street, back toward the shadows where he belonged. The cold hit him fully now, immediate. And brutal, tearing through the thin layer of clothing he had left. His body reacted instantly, shivering violently, his breath catching in his chest. But he kept walking. Behind him, the low rumble of engines roared back to life. And though he didn't look back, everything was about to change. The engines came alive one by one, their deep, thunderous growl rolling through the storm and echoing off the empty buildings. Snow swirled violently in the wake of the motorcycles, headlights cutting sharp beams through the darkness. The men returned from the building in a loose formation, their movements confident, unhurried, until they saw her. She stood where they had left her, but something was different. The jacket. It hung off her shoulders, oversized and worn, the fabric frayed at the edges, sleeves too long for her hands. It didn't belong with the rest of her, didn't match the polished boots or the careful way she carried herself. It looked out of place. And yet, she clutched it like it mattered. One of the bikers slowed as he approached, his brow furrowing. "Where'd that come from?" Another gave a low whistle. "That definitely ain't yours." Ray's stepped forward last, his presence alone enough to quiet the others. Snow clung to his beard and shoulders, but he didn't seem to feel it. His eyes locked onto the jacket immediately, sharp and assessing. "Lena," he said, his voice low but firm. "What is that?" She turned toward him, still holding the jacket closed around herself. For a second, it looked like she didn't know how to explain it. "There was a boy," she said finally, her voice quieter than before. "He came out of nowhere." "A boy," someone repeated, skeptical. "In this," another added, gesturing at the storm. Reyes didn't speak right away. His gaze stayed fixed on her, reading every detail, the way her fingers gripped the fabric, the faint tremor still in her shoulders, the look in her eyes that hadn't been there earlier. "What boy?" he asked. Lena swallowed, then turned slightly, scanning the street behind her. "He was over there. Across the road." She pointed toward the dark storefronts. "He saw I was cold, and he just gave me his jacket." For a moment, the only sound was the wind. One of the bikers let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "You're telling me some street kid walked up and handed you his only coat?" Lena didn't laugh. "Yes." Another man shook his head. "That doesn't make sense." But Reyes' expression had changed. "Where is he now?" he asked. Lena's eyes moved again, searching. "He went back that way. He didn't have anything else on. Just a sweater. That was enough." Reyes turned without another word and started across the street, his boots crunching heavily through the snow. The others exchanged brief glances before following, their earlier ease gone, replaced by something sharper, something uncertain. The storm seemed louder now, pressing in as they reached the darker side of the street. The storefront windows were black, reflecting only faint shapes and the movement of falling snow. For a moment, there was nothing. Then one of them spoke. Over there, near the edge of the alley, half hidden behind a metal dumpster, a small figure lay curled tightly against the wall. Reyes stopped. The sight hit harder than any words could have. The boy was shaking uncontrollably, his body folded in on itself, arms wrapped tightly around his chest in a desperate attempt to hold in what little warmth he had left. His thin sweater offered no real protection, already damp from the snow that had settled into the fabric. His face was pale, lips slightly blue, breath shallow and uneven. For a long second, no one moved. This kid, one of the bikers muttered under his breath, the usual edge in his voice gone. He really did it. Another man rubbed a hand over his face, exhaling sharply. Gave away the only thing keeping him alive. Lena stepped closer, her boots slow and careful now. When she saw him up close, her breath caught. Oh my God. Reyes took a step forward, crouching slightly, his large frame casting a shadow over the boy. Hey, he said, his voice rough but not unkind. Kid. Eli's eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first. It took him a moment to realize he wasn't alone. He blinked, trying to make sense of the figures around him, their silhouettes blurred by the snow and the dim light. Why? Reyes asked, the question coming out before he could stop it. Eli's gaze shifted weakly toward him. She was cold, he whispered. That was all. No hesitation. No second thoughts. Just a simple answer, as if it didn't need explaining. Something in the air changed. The men who stood there, men who had built their lives on strength, on loyalty, on rules that rarely bent, found themselves completely unprepared for something so small and so absolute. Reyes stared at him for a moment longer, then stood abruptly. Get him up, he ordered. The command snapped the others into motion. One of the bikers immediately shrugged off his heavy leather jacket and draped it over Eli's small frame. Another pulled off his gloves, sliding them onto the boy's stiff hands. Someone else crouched down, gently but quickly helping him sit up. Easy, the man muttered. We got you. Eli didn't resist. He barely had the strength. Lena knelt beside him, pulling the oversized jacket, the one he had given her, tighter around his shoulders on top of the others. Stay with me, okay? She said softly. You're going to be all right. His head tilted slightly toward her voice, but his eyes were already starting to close again. Not here, one of the bikers said, glancing around. He needs heat. Nearest place? Reyes asked. Diner. 2 blocks down. Reyes nodded once. We ride. They moved quickly but carefully, lifting Eli as if he were something fragile. One of the men started toward a bike, but Lena stopped him. I'll take him, she said firmly. There was no argument. She climbed onto the motorcycle, settling Eli in front of her, wrapping her arms around him and pulling him close. The layers of jackets helped, but it wasn't enough. She leaned forward slightly, shielding him as best she could from the wind. Hold on, she whispered, though she wasn't sure he could hear. The engines roared to life again, louder now, more urgent. They rode as a unit, tight and controlled, surrounding Lena and the boy like a moving barrier against the storm. Snow lashed against them, the cold biting through even their heavy gear, but none of them slowed. Not this time. The streets blurred past in streaks of white and shadow, the city watching silently as they tore through it. When they reached the diner, the neon sign flickered weakly against the storm, casting a dull glow over the snow-covered lot. Reyes was off his bike before the engines fully died. Inside, he said, already moving. The door slammed open, a burst of cold air sweeping into the warm interior. Conversations stopped instantly as every head turned. Help him, Lena called, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. The staff didn't hesitate for long. Something in the urgency, something in the sight of the small, freezing boy wrapped in layers of leather, was enough. They rushed forward with blankets, clearing space, guiding them to a booth near a heater. Eli was laid down carefully, his body still trembling, though the warmth was already starting to reach him. Hot water, now, someone said. Get towels. Call someone. The room came alive with movement. Lena stayed beside him, one hand resting lightly on his shoulder, as if afraid he might disappear if she let go. Across the room, Reyes stood near the door, watching everything unfold. His arms were crossed, his expression unreadable, but his eyes never left the boy. After a long moment, he spoke. We don't leave him. It wasn't loud, but it carried. Every man in the room heard it, and not one of them disagreed. Outside, the storm raged on, indifferent and unforgiving. But inside, surrounded by warmth and something stronger than any of them expected, The boy who had given everything he had was finally being given something back.